Good day. In our previous video on the Chinook invoices we listed, there was no functionality to add, edit and update an invoice or even delete it. As an example, clicking the delete button should provide a confirmation screen. Clicking the add button should bring up a screen to capture a new invoice. Due to us indicating the sortable and filterable columns, we are able to sort the records, and then clicking the clear sort button resets the sort order. Let's begin the process of creating our input dialog right away. Let's open our layout so that we can add more components. We need to add two message boxes, one for a confirmation and one for our form with input controls. In our form, we will use the same fields we used in the data table or the data source. It is now possible to specify all this information on the form, and then link the data table and the data source to the form. This ensures that the single source of truth is the form. We will place the data table inside the column, inside the first row, then we will add the two dialogs and then start building the form. Let us add the dialogs, the form and some fields. We will right-click the message box and duplicate it. One message box will be used for confirmations and the other will have the form for us to enter invoice content. We place the form inside the message box that we will use for input. We change the names of the dialogs to be more reflective of what we will do. Let's name this one confirm. We change its transition so that it transitions on the x-axis. The dialog type is message because we want to show a message on it. Content on this dialog will be changed by code. For now, let's leave it as it is. It will have a green OK and a gray cancel based on the OK label, OK color, cancel label, and cancel color. Persistent means that the user will have to intervene to close the dialog. The next step is to assign a name to our input dialog, change some properties and then add fields to the form. We name this dialog Invoice Entry. On start, it is hidden. We change its transition. The dialog type this time will be input, as it will be used with a form to enter content. We can also give it a title, but we will change these via code. For now, let's leave everything as is, and start adding content to the form. We give the form a unique name. We also need to specify its parent, that will be the invoice entry dialog, suffixed by the words card text. For CRUD functionality, this form will use the invoices table. You will remember the record source, singular and plural, from the previous example. We also give it a primary key and delete display field. We will, however, make the delete display field the invoice number this time. We had started by building the data table, then the input form. The recommended approach is to always start with the form, then link the data table and link the data source. This ensures that all the parameters used by both the data source and data table are originating from the form, and one does not have to re-enter the content again. From the form, one can also indicate how the styling of all the components should be. They can be rounded, outlined, shaped or filled, the details can be hidden, or be dense, etc. For this form, all the input elements will be rounded and details will be hidden. We will also activate Show Grid Design as we want to demonstrate the various sections of our grid. Let's add some fields to our form. These will be translated to actual components. We will add the fields based on how they are displayed in the table. We will start with the invoice ID field, then add others. We need to place the fields inside the VForm. As it's a text field, we name with a text prefix. We then indicate the title or the caption that should be displayed on the label of the invoice. The field name should be the actual field name on your database. This will be used for data binding. The row and column indicate where the field component should be placed inside the form. We will make these rest on row 1, column 1. The invoice number is stored as an integer type. We select that on the data type. A field can represent any type of input component. It can be a switch, a combo box, a date picker, etc. We will use a text field for the invoice number. Users can enter it. The data table is also able to have input components for inline editing. So we selected the component that will be used on the data table for the invoice number. We just want to display the invoice number, so we select normal. It will not be used for inline editing. Fields can be visible and not visible. The invoice number should be visible, so we let this show. The invoice number content should be used for CRUD functionality. Will this field be used in the order by clause of the SQL statement? Must this field be displayed on the data table? Is this field filterable on the data table? Is this field sortable on the data table? If you remember, on the data table we specified sortable and filterable fields so that we can sort and search the data table content. The field on the form will speak to these properties in the data table. When using the VForm first approach, there will not be a need to enter data table properties or data source properties, as these can be linked with a single call to the form. We save our layout and then continue to create our form. It is also important that we generate members for the components. This action will ensure that we can click the OK and cancel buttons in our dialogs and the information can be saved. We generate members for the confirm dialog. We need its OK and cancel click methods. We also generate for the form and the invoice entry dialog too. For the input dialogs, besides the OK and cancel click events, the visible event should also be selected. This is needed for all forms that have rules on the components. The members are generated. Let's execute bind state on them so that they become usable. We finish up the bind state code. We then need to ensure that we have loaded the right layout. Let's continue doing the edits on our form and add more controls. The next component inline is the customer ID. We can use a combo box for that to select customers from a list. We duplicate the previous field and then update it. We give it a unique name and we will assign it a component type of autocomplete. This should show on the second row in the form. The next component is the invoice date. Let's add a new field and give it a date picker component type. We will place this on the third row in the form. We set the component type to date picker. The customer combo should show a list of customers to select from. We make this an autocomplete component type. We want the user to be able to add records, edit and delete them. Let's generate the events for the data table. We need the add event. We will also make the data table have a back button. Let's check that. We need each row to have an edit and delete button, so that we can update and delete it. Let's check that. We will also add refresh, so that we can reload the data table data. Previously, we executed a fetch of the records when the page is created, which ended up showing the invoices in the data table. When a user clicks refresh on the data table, we must execute a reload of the records. Let's call load records here. This method is registered on the component, so we call it by name. This will show a load-in indicator on the table and execute a select all against the data source based on the parameters on the data source. Our previous select all callback needs to be updated. We need to trap the success or failure of the execution. We copy the code from the sub-definition internal to the library. We update the copied code with the names of our data table and data source. It's important that we trap the success as internet might be disconnected or an error experienced, so that we don't have an endless loop. If the execution fails, a dialog warning will be shown. We delete the old subroutine. Next, we want to show an input dialog to capture new invoices. Let's update the add click code. Adding a new record needs to prepare the data source for a new record. This sets its mode to create and sets the default values, so let's call the data source add method. We will copy the source code from the helper code and then update it with the names of our dialog and data table. We had changed the dialog name from invoice entry to DLG invoice. We want the dialog title to be add invoice when we add a new invoice. The OK button label should be Save. Then we show the dialog. The dialog has an OK and Cancel buttons. We need to trap these. Let's update the copied code and update the OK and Cancel button events of the dialog. When the OK button is clicked, the active record is read. We want to perform some validations on it. After that we turn off the loading indicator and then execute a create or update against the data source. We are using a create or update call because when a user clicks an edit button on the row, it will show the same dialog, but the mode will not be create, it will be update, on the data source. A form will be validated if it has rules. Rules should be added to the form after load layout but before bind state. In this case we are executing a save against the database via the data source only when the rules are valid. When a user cancels the entry, we just want to hide the dialog. To refresh, when the Add button in the data table is clicked, we execute an add against the data source. We then show the dialog that has our form, showing Add Invoice and a Save button. The user will then capture the invoice information and click the Save button. When that happens, the entered content should be validated. Once validated, the database should be updated. The update to the database is done via the data source. We use create or update of the data source as the mode of the data source can either be create or update. When we called add, the mode was create, however when we call edit, the mode will be update. Let's run our web app and test the code we have written so far. What we have done is get content from a MySQL database via PHP. We then displayed this content on a data table. The data table has no create, read, update and delete functionality. Now with this adding functionality, we are able to have a dialog to be able to create new invoices. All the invoices are loaded successfully. Let's click the Add button to create a new invoice. Our dialog is shown, with a transition from the top. We had decided to show the grid design earlier, we will later turn this off. What matters is that when we specified the row and column position of each field, our grid has been generated. The Done button hides the dialog and the Save button also does something, and it does not conclude, all because we are not done coding all of this functionality. See you in the next video.